My name is Gorman, and in this episode of Semilla.VC, I sit down with Alex Laplaza, partner at Lowercarbon Capital. He's held a number of roles at Lowercarbon, starting as an associate, then principal, and is now currently a partner. He was a 2020 fellow at the Clean Energy Leadership Institute, a visiting scholar at Harvard University, an associate at Renew Power, and a Fulbright Scholar, and a critical language scholar with the U.S. State Department. He holds a master's degree from Stanford University in international policy with a focus on energy, environment, and natural resources, and an honors bachelor's degree from American University in international studies. In this episode, we discussed how governments and regulatory bodies in Latin America are supporting and fostering the growth of climate tech in the region, how climate tech in Latin America is different from climate tech in the United States and Europe, and which specific sectors within climate tech in Latin America are witnessing the most innovation and investment. We discussed all this and more in this episode of Semilla.VC. Okay, Alex, could you start by telling the audience a bit more about your work history up to and including your current role at Lowercarbon Capital?
Yeah, so my career actually started in Indonesia. I graduated undergrad from American University in DC and left to go spend about a year and a half in Indonesia as a Fulbright Scholar, working on issues of food and water security, and realized there that while I was working on food and water security, that I really needed to learn more about energy. The specific reason being that as the communities I worked with were losing their rivers due to deforestation. So they would have flooding in the wet season and drought in the dry season. And I realized if they had energy access, then they wouldn't need to deforest their forests for fuel. And so went back to Stanford to learn more about energy, get a little more deeper into the world of energy, did a degree in international policy. And there is when I spent some time working in India, working at Renew Power, India's largest clean energy power producer, and also did some work on the electrification of mobility in East Africa, specifically in Kenya and Uganda. And really at Stanford, it's hard to be working on policy when people are just building cool things all around you. I felt like I was just doing a whole lot of reading and writing that people really would never care about, while people were making tangible impacts and differences just by building and exploring and aiming to scale solutions. So I learned about lower carbon on a podcast, actually, oddly enough, the My Climate Journey podcast. My colleague Clay, one of the founding partners of Lower Carbon, went on and pulled back the curtain for the first time about the work they were doing. And I was really excited, dropped everything, applied, and was fortunate to get it. And that was 3 years ago. And really was lucky with the timing. Just got a ticket on the rocket ship, and it's been a fun ride.
Amazing. So I want to talk about that work history. I want to talk about your role at Lowercarbon Capital. But first, because of the audience, I have to ask, you do climate tech, and this is a podcast about Latin America. So could you tell the audience more about climate tech in Latin America, how it's different from climate tech in the United States, and just that whole story arc there?
Yeah. So I've been working pretty deeply in LATAM for the past 2 years or so, just out of recognition that the opportunity for climate tech in LATAM is just absolutely massive. I'm super bullish on the region and the opportunity for climate tech specifically in the region. And there's a few reasons why. Mostly that I just think it has a natural advantage in becoming a world leader in what is a generational investment opportunity, a generational industrial transformation. It's got a lot of the natural ingredients, and in many ways, a lot of the biggest sectors and industries and companies in the region are already climate companies. They're just often not thought of it as so. I'm thinking about large steel, chemicals, agricultural companies, coffee, soy, beef, sugarcane. These are all really important for climate tech, and they're also some of the biggest sectors already. And so there's the natural advantage there. And so the way I kind of view climate tech for the region is just by increasing the efficiency of these industries, right? There's a lot of low-hanging fruit in making these industries that are already massive and quite productive more productive. I think the region still kind of views climate tech as, ESG, kind of this fluffy philanthropy, not really a serious money-making endeavor. But what I often say is, in business, sustainability and efficiency are often one and the same, right? The definition of efficiency is to produce more, to do more with fewer resources. And when you do that, that's just inherently sustainable. And so you apply that at scale to some of these massive industries. The impacts for the climate are quite substantial, and in doing so, you make quite a bit of money. Yeah.
I love it. And so for the audience in Latin America that might not know about lower carbon, I'd love to hear more about like kind of what it is in your words, because it, in the US, it's one of the foremost climate tech VCs. So I'd love a little bit of insight there. And then maybe you can transition that directly into telling the audience more about your investments in Latin America through lower carbon.
Sure. So Lowercarbon, we're an early stage venture capital fund. We invest in pre-seed, seed, and Series A companies, startups, and solutions to any solution or technology to reduce or remove greenhouse gas emissions, as well as what we call buying more time. That's enhancing the climate resilience or adaptations of communities, often through a technology or technological solution. The thesis is pretty straightforward, right? It's in the name. We're pretty cross-sectoral or sector agnostic, we're geography agnostic. It's just recognizing that it's climate is such a multifaceted problem, and there's just a plethora of solutions, and we want to be open to finding the most scalable and impactful solutions. To be clear, we're not an impact fund. We don't call ourselves that. We think that the way to have an impact is by building a huge, valuable, and profitable business. Impact doesn't lead to scale. Scale leads to impact is kind of how we view it. So we've invested in about almost 100 companies to date, and across maybe 5 continents. US, Europe, India, LATAM, East Africa. So pretty global. I do a lot of work leading our emerging markets focus, and within that, I spent quite a bit of time in LATAM, in particular Brazil and Mexico, looking at opportunities for climate tech companies. The companies that we've invested in to date are 2 in Brazil, one called Lemon Energy in the solar space, and another called Musa in waste management in Brazil, just digitizing a fairly archaic industry today. And then the third is a company called Solada in Mexico City that is it's building a fintech platform to kind of catalyze the flows of capital into renewables in the country.
I'm always hesitant to ask investors to describe one of their investments, because then they're worried that the others are they're sad that they didn't get mentioned. But I'd love for you to pick one of those 3 and just dive deeper into why you invested into them, and no hard feelings to the other founders.
Sure, I'll go with Lemon because that was my first foray into LATAM, our first investment in the region. And Lemon Energy is a community solar platform. Community solar is the idea of communities often, or businesses, even homeowners and just retail consumers often can't afford, or just practically speaking cannot have access to solar, right? They don't have space on the roof, they can't afford the down payment, whatever the barriers are. But it's possible for you to, instead of paying the electricity bill you pay today, you just pay a distributed generation site. So say somewhere a few fields away, instead of paying my electricity bill, I give you that same amount, the same money I'm putting towards my electricity bill today to fund the generation of somewhere far off. So Lemon is kind of the node that connects the two. They connect small and medium businesses to distributed generation sites. It means these small and medium businesses have access to low-cost solar. It's lower cost than the grid. They save on their power bills. They get clean energy. And so it's not an exact, these companies aren't paying exactly for the electrons. They're not consuming the energy directly from these solar plants. They're just paying for that solar plant to inject the same amount that they consume into the grid. So it's just kind of a balancing, and you need a Lemon to kind of connect the two. And the reason why I think this is exciting in Brazil in particular is because Brazil is highly dependent on hydro power for the grid. It's one of the cleanest grids in the world already, because they've built out such massive hydro power infrastructure. The challenge is climate change. It's going to really disrupt precipitation patterns. Droughts can lead to lower water levels, which lead to far higher electricity bills. So Brazilian consumers, Brazilian businesses really feel that pain kind of annually as drought increases and their power bills increase. So, meanwhile, Brazil's just very sunny, right? Every point of Brazil is far sunnier than any point of Germany. And so the opportunity for Brazil to be a solar leader is really exciting. And I think Lemon has a really interesting business model to unlock that.
I love that. And I love that the challenge is the climate. That's very interesting. I have to ask, because I think a lot of the audience, even if they're looking at deal flow, they're not looking at climate tech deal flow, and they've really no idea what's going on in the US versus what's going on in Latin America. So when you're seeing deal flow from Latin America and you're seeing deal flow from the US, what are the differences? What are the types of problems they're solving? Give us a little more of that color there.
Yeah, I would say the number one thing is in my space is just the technical talent. In the US and in Europe, a lot of climate tech today is fairly what you could just consider deep tech. So a lot of hard science innovation, a lot of technical challenges and technical de-risking. And that is yet to emerge as meaningfully in LATAM. The technical talent is certainly there. It's often not working on climate tech. And so I think that's the biggest marker. I think that's the biggest difference. The second I would say is it's still, as I alluded to earlier, climate is still thought of as this kind of fringe, kind of fluffy, feel good, philanthropic business case, when in the US and in Europe, they very much see it as an economic opportunity. It's just, industrial transformation. The US and Europe are kind of in a green arms race, so to speak, to see who could be the leader of this new this transformation, this global economic transformation, and they see the economic benefits of doing so, of being that leader. Whereas the talent in a lot of LATAM, they are interested in climate tech, but often there are seemingly far more lucrative places to be spending your time and energy, at least if you're building a startup. So that's still a challenge, but I think it's changing. I think people are starting to recognize that you can have a meaningful and lucrative career while working on climate.
You talked about that green arms race. I feel like a lot of that is fueled by governments, institutional LPs. A lot of people want to put their money into climate tech funds like Lowercarbon. How do you see that as like juxtaposed with Latin America? Is there that same government societal push towards that sort of clean tech innovation, or is that something that you're only seeing in the places you mentioned, like North America and Western Europe?
Yeah, actually, in LATAM, I've been pretty pleased to see that the governments are actually very forward-looking and very proactive, and there's a lot of incentives being erected to cultivate climate tech industries. I think the gap is mostly on the founder level to date, transparently, but yeah, governments across the region are really being quite aggressive. I think Mexico is one exception. Mexico is kind of in many ways kind of moving in the opposite direction in terms of the current administration and their preference for fossil fuels. But in Brazil, the Lula's administration is very forward looking, not just on the Amazon, but on industrial decarbonization more generally. Chile and Argentina realize that they have a massive role to play in global decarbonization because of their mining industries and their lithium resources, and finding a way to make it sustainable, both in terms of environmental impact, but also in terms of the livelihoods and making sure their populations benefit from this global trend. So there's a lot of really exciting things happening on the government side in LATAM, in South America in particular, focused on trying to become a leader in this global trend. It's still high level. A lot of it is still filtering down. But that's important. It kind of, sets the bar. It points to a direction in which people should be looking and moving. And I think the next years are going to be pretty exciting.
Amazing. I want to illuminate a little more of your thesis on Latin American climate tech. What are you most excited about right now, both in the climate tech space at large and also specifically Latin America?
Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, like I said, with Latin America, I think a lot of it is just applying technologies, new business models, new solutions to the sectors and industries that are already there, massive and mature today. I can give you some concrete examples. Let's take Brazil. Brazil is the world's largest importer of fertilizer. Obviously, it's an agricultural powerhouse, one of the largest agricultural producers in the world, use quite a bit of fertilizer, but a lot of it is imported. And that's expensive. It raises food costs, it's imports. And yet today it's possible with new technologies to produce fertilizer from solar power. Today it's typically produced from fossil fuels and chemicals, but it is possible to produce the exact same chemical fertilizers using solar power and renewable electricity. Brazil obviously has an abundance of sun, has an abundance of wind. I think it's kind of an opportunity to use that renewable energy abundance, that renewable energy resource potential, and convert it into a homegrown fertilizer industry in which they reduce their imports, reduce their food costs, increase farmer livelihoods, just by using their solar and wind resources. I use this example as kind of one to illustrate a broader point in that climate tech is just fundamentally beneficial to these economies. It's not just to feel better about themselves, to have some obligation to the global community to reduce their emissions. It's a win-win, right? There is self-interest. So generally, those are the opportunities I really am looking for in LATAM. Are companies and solutions in which self-interest is the means by which they scale. I think self-interest is the best way to scale. It's, you got to have the right financial incentives, particularly in LATAM. And so that's what I'm excited by. I'm looking for win-win solutions that do good by the planet and do good by people and consumers and businesses. I would say that's true across the globe. Generally, like I said earlier, Lowercarbon, we're not an impact fund. We just think that the way to have impact is by building businesses that can stand on their own 2 feet and are sustainable by nature.
That's amazing. So you mentioned Mexico and Brazil as 2 of the countries that you spend a lot of time in comparatively for Latin America. I'd be interested to know, where do you see the future in the next 2 years, both geographically and sector-wise, about where climate tech is going to go in Latin America?
Yeah, it's funny. In Brazil, I was there a few times last year, and the interest in Web3 and crypto is pretty palpable. I felt there was, a lot of folks were working on that rather than working on climate. These days, it's probably AI. But I think climate has eaten a lot of the share as kind of this counter-cyclical almost and resilient sector to build in. And so now that we are in more of a downturn macroeconomically and in the startup world and investment world, I think a lot of folks are seeing climate and seeing that it is far more resilient, and it's there's multi-decade tailwinds here, and so a lot of more people are going to be looking towards it. So that's what I'm most excited about in the region, that folks that would otherwise be working on crypto or fintech or AI are now looking at climate as a really exciting and tantalizing opportunity. In Brazil and Mexico specifically, a lot of that is still manifesting in business model innovation more than technical innovation, which for the reasons I alluded to earlier are understandable. And but that being said, there's still a lot of really exciting opportunities. There's a lot of business models that have worked elsewhere being applied in the region and kind of tweaked to the local context. But there's also new business models that are emerging and homegrown native business models that make sense for the region. And those I think are really exciting. And so it's really just looking out towards these new technologies that have been fairly de-risked elsewhere, things like solar and wind and EV and electric vehicles and batteries, and finding business models that work for the region. Those are the opportunities I'm pretty excited by.
So as promised before, I want to discuss a little bit more about your career. You rose from associate to principal and then to partner at Lowercarbon in less than 2 years. I think a lot of people look at that and, after their applause, they're like, wow, how did you do that? So the question that I want to ask is, what advice would you give yourself to you when you were joining VC, knowing what you know now that maybe some of the people in the audience could take? And then how does one have that meteoric rise so quickly?
So I started VC in 2020. when it was quote unquote good times. Everything was frothy, everything was going up. The public markets, the private markets were just extremely bullish. Interest rates were still low, and that was my entry into VC, and that's when I that kind of was my understanding of what it was and how it would be. I knew that things felt pretty exceptional, but I didn't spend too much time thinking about the world after the cycle turned. And it's just it was hard to, because everything was moving so quickly, and you don't want to be caught up. You always need to be kind of in the know and up to date, and it's harder to look ahead. So I guess my advice would be just to have a longer term outlook and perspective, and brace yourself for changes. Things can always change on a dime. In terms of moving up from associate to partner, really the advice I'd give to anyone is just put yourself in the right places. I was very, very lucky, very fortunate, very privileged to join Lowercarbon when I did. I think the path I've had within Lowercarbon is far more a function of timing than it is any skill or aptitude or competence. The other part is that I just work with really good people, and those people really are empowering, and they want the best for me and for my teammates. And so the kind of modus operandi is really to put people in positions that they might not be necessarily qualified for on paper or have experience with, and just look for people that can learn quickly and grow and adapt, and challenge them to do so. And that's kind of the challenge I've been given. I can't say that I necessarily earned the position I'm in, but I appreciate the challenge, and it's been far more motivating than anything else I can imagine. So that would be my advice to anyone else: is put yourself in the right position and try to work with really good people.
So finally, I have to ask Peter Thiel's famous contrarian question, but with uniquely Semilla.VC twist. What important truth about Latin America do very few people agree with you on?
I'll say it again. I've been saying it constantly, and I keep pounding the drum, but the opportunity with climate tech in LATAM is a really valuable opportunity. There's immense potential to create and capture quite a bit of value. So there's a lot of serious money to be made in climate tech in LATAM. And I'm not just talking about forest carbon and the Amazon. That's all we see these days is forest carbon on the blockchain, but it's so much more than that. It's so much deeper than that. And I think it's far more interesting than that narrow and fairly myopic view. And so that's what I'd say is it's not philanthropy. It's just good business. And I think there's still a lot of people that still view it as fluffy philanthropy, but really it's just good business.
Well, what a fantastic answer, Alex. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on the Semilla.VC podcast today. I very much appreciate your time.
Thank you, Trip. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you for watching this episode of Semilla.VC. Make sure to like and subscribe wherever you view the podcast. Follow me on Twitter @GormanTrip. And be sure to check out our newsletter, Dealflow LA, which can be found by going to dealflow.la.